So we've worked out that directors are the ones that we hold to account because the company is a legal fiction. We've worked out who directors are and who they owe their duties to, the company as a whole. But what are those duties that they owe? Look, roughly we're going to say there's three. There's two core generic duties, and then there's everything else. Why is there everything else? Short reason. There is so much specific legislation that might put a duty on you as a director that we can't list it all. You would have to work out which specific pieces of legislation apply. However, these two generic duties, the other two generic ones that we concentrate on, or two areas of owing a duty, they apply to everyone, and they actually apply to the application of all the other things that you owe as a director. So what are those two? Act honestly and avoid conflicts of interest, what you might call a fiduciary duty or a duty not to self-deal, and a duty of due care and diligence, or to apply yourself to the actual task of directing. And that's what we're going to get into more detail on. Now, should I go through this? Yes, very briefly. The idea of directors' duties and fiduciary duties evolved before we had the law of negligence. That means technically the duty to act with due care and diligence is a fiduciary duty. It's a fiduciary duty. But I kind of I think it's best to separate it out conceptually. It's really a little bit more like negligence in terms of what you have to do. Because you hold this role, you can't be negligent in it, right? You've got to pay attention. And it's not really about self-dealing, which is what these other ones are. So while technically it's part of the fiduciary duty, I think conceptually it's quite a separate one, which is why we've got the two key generic duties of directors. Before we go too far, I also want to just hark back a little bit to how our legal system works. And you'll remember that we are a common law system, right? Which means we have case law and we have statute, right? And the origins of these duties are clearly in case law. And there is a whole series of specific requirements under fiduciary duties that are within case law. For instance, I'll give you an example just so you get a flavour. One is a director may not fetter their discretion. Okay, fetter their discretion. What the hell does that mean? Well, that means that when you take on a directorship, you can't say that you're going to vote a certain way in order to get that position, right? You have to take an open mind to all the decisions. You can't bind up, you can't fetter your discretion making, your ability to make decisions. Okay. So we're not going to discuss specifics like that. Why? Because the Parliament has enacted statutes that really codify the basis of these case law requirements. And these statutes are what get pursued in court. Okay, so these statutes have come to predominate our legal system. Now, you'll remember also, though, that statutes prevail over case law. That's part of our system. So if there's a conflict, the statute prevails. But the case law is still there. So these duties are all still there, but the statutes are the one that prevail and get used the most, and they cover virtually every situation you could come across. That's why we concentrate on the statutes and the Corporations Act, which sets out those specific articulations of the self-dealing requirements and the care and diligence requirements. So the first set of requirements that we have are around these fiduciary or self-dealing duties. Okay? So essentially, you're acting for someone else, not yourself. Therefore, you've got to put their interests at the forefront of everything that you think about when you're making a decision. That's the key thing going on here, right? There are some specifics around how that's been enacted in legislation and the law, but really that's the core idea. Don't be dodgy. So let's get into some of the details. Fiduciary duty arises because one person, in this case the director, needs to put the interests of another, in this case the company, ahead of their own. Okay, so this happens in lots of situations. So the fiduciary duty arises with where the director needs to put the interests of the company, the director, above, needs to put the interests of another. So we're going to concentrate on 4 core expressions of this requirement. Okay, so this happens. A director must act in good faith for a proper purpose. Director must avoid conflicts of interest. Director must not misuse the position, and a director must not misuse information. We're going to concentrate on 4 core let's go through those of this requirement. So over here, you can see the specific provision that a director, notice, or other officer, right? So the senior managers are also covered by this, not just directors. A director or other officer of a corporation must exercise their powers and discharge their duties in good faith, in the best interests of the corporation, and for a proper purpose. Really important. There's a distinction, right? Good faith, best interest is not necessarily exactly the same as a proper purpose. And that's what this judgment is really getting to, yeah? There's a species of dishonesty, of doing things, where the director is doing something that they really think is good for the company, but it's not for a proper purpose. Okay, so let's give an example of what that might be. The classic example that I can remember is where a director who had founded the company honestly believed that the company would be better off if they had a certain number of people as the shareholders who could own the company, right? So think about this. What you had was a family company, right? And yes, you had a patriarch in charge of it, and they had some kids, and imagine that each one had a share, and that there might have been, I think in this case, 4 girls, 3 boys, and they each had a share. The father honestly believes, let's say let's go 4 boys and 5 girls, right? Well, it's not about the gender, it's about the issue. Now imagine that all of these kids, 9 kids, that's a lot, isn't it? But imagine all these kids have a share. The father honestly believes that it would be better if the boys had control, right? So what the father does is issue 4 more shares and gives them to the boys. So now we got 8-5, right? Boys are now in control and can control the company. Now, the father may honestly believe that's the best thing for the company, right? So they're acting in good faith in what they believe is the best interest of the corporation. However, what's the purpose of issuing shares? The purpose of issuing shares is to raise capital. So the father had issued shares not to raise capital, but to wrest control from one group to another. And therefore, in taking that action, they had not done it for a proper purpose. So what you can see is there are cases where acting honestly is not enough. You have to be doing it for a proper purpose. Now, realistically, most of the time when you're acting honestly, it'll be covered, right? You'll cover yourself like this. But you do have to think about from time to time, are we making this decision for the right purpose, for a proper purpose? We're not trying to get around some rule in what we're doing here as a director. Now, in addition to acting bona fide for a proper purpose, directors need to avoid conflicts of interest. That's a pretty clear one, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I think it's a bit more complex than what might first seem to be the case. One of the things to remember about conflicts of interest is that the law generally takes conflict of interest in regard to an issue. Why is that important? Well, in a lot of corporate governance, we talk about independent directors. Independent directors are those free from conflicts of interest. But if you think about it, a director might be independent on issue A and not independent on issue B. So there's this conflation of the level of analysis that occurs in governance. Sure, maybe sometimes we're so conflicted, we might be influenced about a range of decisions. We might be in the thrall of management if they have some power over us, for instance. But in many cases, that's probably not the case. It's we're conflicted about very specific issues before us. So while we have here avoiding conflicts of interest, it's a little bit more about how do you appropriately manage those topics where there is a conflict of interest, okay? So I think that's an important distinction. I think the second thing that we need to be aware of is the difference between the legal position and what actually occurs in governance. Okay, so I think a lot of what happens around conflict of interest is dealing as much with reputation and legitimacy and the perception of a conflict of interest rather than the actual legal problem of conflict of interest. And we can get into that into a little more detail, but we're going to concentrate here on what is the bare minimum, what is the legal requirement when we're dealing with conflicts of interest. Now, the basic idea that we have here is that we have the board, this group, and that group, the board, should be making decisions in the interest of the company, not themselves. So therefore, you don't want the bias of any individual to infect or warp that decision process. And that's what these provisions are about. How do we make sure we get unbiased decisions in the interest of the company? So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So as we know, all agents, and directors are a kind of agent, have a duty to avoid conflicts of interest with their principal, but conflicts of interest are all around in business. They're ubiquitous. So we're going to deal with what happens under the Corporations Act. And there's a great case, Aberdeen Railway Company and Blakey Brothers. So what you had was Aberdeen Railway Company who had to buy some railway sleepers, and Aberdeen Railway sleepers were actually made by a company called Blakey Brothers. Now, Mr. Blakey happened to serve on the board of both the Aberdeen Railway Company, because he knew a lot about railroads, and he served on the board of Blakey Brothers, a director on both. And in this case, dealing with the purchase of some railway sleepers from Blakey Brothers by Aberdeen Railway, of course that's where they bought them from, the judge made the observation, look, how can you be doing your duty for Blakey Brothers, which is to maximise the price of railway sleepers, at the same time as you're minimising the price of railway sleepers that would be your duty under Aberdeen Railway Companies as your directorship there? Clearly, you can't do both at the same time, and you have a conflict of interest that's irreconcilable. It's impossible to avoid all conflicts of interest. What we find is that we need to manage them, and we have some prescriptions under the Corporations Act. So, what we do is we have a different situation for a smaller company. You remember PTY LTDs have less than 50 members. They are not open to the public, so they're not open to the public. Public companies, LTDs, can have more than 50 members, and you can raise capital with the public. So they kind of affect more people. Think about it that way. And as we have a bigger impact, we get more regulations. So these are our two situations, an LTD or a PTY LTD. In a smaller PTY LTD, directors must disclose their interests at the first possible meeting, but they can be present and vote on the issue. Okay? In contrast, in a public company, you've got to disclose your interest, but they can't vote or be present unless the other directors pass a resolution saying that they can. Okay, so really what we're doing is we're letting everyone know the nature and extent of our conflict of interest so that the other directors can take that into account when they're voting and listening to that director. In one instance, where the company is more tightly held, the director can stay and vote. Remember, they would still be breaching their duty if they vote in their interest, not the company. Right? So this is an important point to think about. You actually haven't breached your duty if you vote for something in your self-interest, if you believe it's in the interests of the company. The problem is where you favour your interest over the company. That's the breach. So you can vote for something that's in your interest if it's in the company's interest and not breach any provision, provided you do these technical elements, of course, right? So provided you disclose that interest. Okay, so there'd be no breach there. However, you've got to be careful, right? It's very easy to kid yourself. So because of issues of perception, most people would say it's very advisable to get the board to allow you to vote if you're a PTY Ltd. And a lot of companies would suggest you just shouldn't vote. Now, you're allowed to, right? You're very clearly allowed to under both provisions. But a lot of companies decide that directors probably shouldn't vote on the matter if they're conflicted for issues of perception. Okay, finally, conflict of interest. What do we mean? What is a conflict of interest? Well, it's really not defined. It's defined as a material personal interest. So it has to be something that could affect your decision. Now, what might affect your decision? That can vary with who you are. So for instance, an issue of $10,000 might affect my decision making, but it might not affect, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch's decision making, if that makes sense, right? It's less material to a billionaire than it is to me, $10,000. A material personal interest could be a friendship, right? It's a personal interest that's material that could affect it. So this is a case-by-case, a general kind of terminology to say anything that would affect your decision-making objectivity. Final two areas of this self-dealing that we're going to deal with are specific provisions to deal with directors, officers, or other employees, like really importantly, right? So it captures you even if you're not an officer. And it's about what you do in your role when you're working for the company. You can't misuse your position and you can't misuse information. So that misuse doesn't need to be for your benefit. It can be for you or anyone else, or if you do it to cause detriment to the corporation. Okay, so let's hop in and have a look at those. So just like avoiding conflicts of interest when we're making a decision, you can't misuse your position. And in fact, if you're a director, voting a certain way could be deemed a misuse of position. If you're voting for something that's in your interest, not the company, that would be an example of a misuse of position. So you can't misuse your position to gain an advantage for yourself or anyone else. So you don't even need to know the person who you're benefiting, and it would still be a misuse of position. You have to use the position. What's a proper use of the position? The benefit of the corporation. It also applies to keep harm, right? Here, you can't cause detriment to the corporation, Part B. So that would get people trying to, be vindictive against the corporation that they're on. Okay. So that's misuse of or use of position. The same applies to the use of information. So remember that when you're working for someone else, anyone else, the information you gain as a result of that work belongs to them, not you. That applies, for instance, if you're a consultant or an advisor. When you're doing work for someone else, it's their information that you get, not yours. Okay, so you've got to treat it that way. The same thing applies when you're a director, an officer, or an employee. The information you get as part of your position is the company's information. And so you must use that for a proper purpose. You can't use it to gain an advantage for yourself or anyone else or cause detriment to the corporation. Sometimes this can cause real problems for directors, particularly if they don't agree with what's going on in a company, right? You may find in the press now that if you read it and you see that sometimes a director or a chair or CEO retires for family reasons, etc. Well, do they really retire for family reasons? Often not. But why aren't they telling you why they retire? Well, a lot of the time, if they tell you why, if they tell you what they don't agree with, then what they're going to be doing is using information gained as part of their role as a director or other officer. And if they do so, and it causes harm to the company, they can be breaching this provision. So there actually is a genuine ethical issue here. When you leave a company, and it's not strictly illegal what's going on, so you can't employ any kind of whistleblower provision, but you don't agree with what's going, can you actually talk about it, right? Legally, if you're using the information, it's the company's information. Ethically, well, I'll leave that up to you as part of the conundrum. But it is one of the reasons that we often hear people not speaking about what they really think is going wrong when they're in leadership positions in organisations.